Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green and the Socialist Party presidential nominee in 2020. And this podcast is Green Socialist Notes. And it's about continuing to educate and advocate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. So I'm going to talk a little bit before we get to the comments and questions, particularly about climate. But, I think the first thing I want to note is that presentation by the January 6th committee was pretty compelling. If you've been following the news, there's been new news coming out all the time documenting more and more how Trump and the Republicans really did try to stage a coup after the 2020 presidential election. And, after watching that presentation Thursday, and they got more presentations coming up, I think there's no doubt that we face an authoritarian neo-fascist threat from the far-right Republicans because they're not backing down. And but we also understand that the Democrats are not so innocent. Here in New York, you know that we petitioned to get back on the ballot, and it looks like we're not going to make it. The Democrats suppressed the vote by suppressing the Green Party. We know from exit polls in 2016 that 61% of the voters for Jill Stein would have stayed home, not voted, if she was not on the ballot. So we bring new voters out to the polls. And if you suppress the Green Party, you're suppressing the vote. In liberal New York, where the Democrats have supermajorities in both chambers and the governorship, are the poster child for this voter suppression. They, in 2020, tripled the number of votes, more than tripled, and tripled the number to stay on the ballot, and tripled the number of votes, signatures needed to get back on the ballot. And so, we tried to get 45,000 signatures in 42 days, and we actually got 7,967, which is still a lot of work. Shows that thousands of people want us on the ballot. But the minions of the chair of the state Democratic Party in Nassau County, where he's the county chair as well, have challenged not just the Green petition, but all 7 nominating petitions that were filed in New York. And that includes the Libertarians, a good government kind of corporate centrist party called the Unite Party that was running a pro-choice Republican who's also trying to win the Republican primary, named Harry Wilson. There were 2 third-party petitions by the leading Republican, Lee Zeldin, who's a Trumpy, trying to revive the Independence Party, which was created by Ross Perot and Tom Golisano, billionaires. It's sort of been a patronage party. It lost its ballot access. And then a couple petitions by marginal people we never heard of, and their petitions were pretty marginal. But the Democrats are knocking all 7 of these petitions off the ballot. And so we're going to be left with a 2-candidate, 4-ballot line race, which is most races in New York. The Democrats, often with the Working Families Party, running the same candidate, and the Republicans, often with the Conservative Party, running the same candidate. It's really a 2-party system with 4 ballot lines. And in this case, it's going to be a corporate neoliberal Democrat named Kathy Hochul, who loves to give money to corporations. Ralph Nader's column this week, if you want to look it up, there's a lot of information about that. $1 billion for a billionaire who owns the Buffalo Bills to build a new stadium, and $10 billion in corporate tax breaks for potential computer chip manufacturers, among other things. And the Republican is an extremist, Trump-loving Republican named Lee Zeldin. So there's a huge vacuum on the left. So we're probably going to still run a write-in campaign to at least give progressives a way to vote for universal health care, building public renewables through the New York Power Authority, all the economic and social supports and economic Bill of Rights, and a program for an inclusive democracy, including fair ballot access, ranked choice voting for statewide offices, and proportional representation in the state legislature through proportional ranked choice voting in multi-member districts. And so we're going to keep, as we say in a statement, which maybe we can put in the chat that we sent out when we realized we were being challenged. As I said at the end, knocking us off the ballot hurts us, but it's not going to stop us. So that is the report on ballot access here in New York. So that banner behind me is now looks like it's going to be a write-in campaign, because New York now has, as far as we can tell, the hardest petition for a comparable office in the world by a factor of 3. The next hardest we can find is in Putin's Russia, where if you want to run as an independent for the highest office up for election in an oblast, which is the equivalent of a state here, and that's running for the state Duma, like our Congress, you need 15,000 signatures in 45 days, which is hard. Our old standard in New York was 15,000 in 42 days. And, we've been shopping a bill around to state legislators, to Democrats, because with supermajorities in both houses, you got to have Democratic sponsorship if it's going to pass. And I joke with these legislators, we just want to get back to the Putin standard. And they chuckle and they admit that we're right, but they say they don't want to get Governor Hochul and the state chair, Jay Jacobs, on their back before the election, where they're trying to get reelected this November. So, the ones we've talked to have said they'll maybe do it after the election. But we're going to keep looking for a legislator with some backbone so we can have a bill we can actually campaign for and begin to mobilize people around. So while we have this democracy crisis here in our country, the world faces a climate crisis that keeps getting worse without any real action in response to it. Now, Monday, Joe Biden invoked the Defense Production Act to accelerate domestic production of clean energy technologies, covering 5 areas: solar panel components, building insulation, heat pumps, equipment for making and using clean electricity generated fuels, for example, hydrogen, green hydrogen, and fuel cells, and power grid infrastructure components. And they're going to use federal procurement, easing tariffs on imported components, expanding the permitting of renewables on public lands, and easing the federal permitting of community-based renewables. Now, this is all good. The problem is it's not big enough. The goal stated in the White House briefing paper that was released when Biden made this announcement on Monday said the goal is up to increase renewables up to 10 megawatts directly and up to 100 indirectly by partnering with local and state government over the next decade. And, that sounds like a lot. Bill McKibben is over the moon about this announcement. But I think it's really just a token gesture compared to what's needed. Climate action through the public sector, using the Defense Production Act, is the kind of policy we need. So the form is good, but the scale is just woefully insufficient. When we estimated in our Eco-Socialist Green New Deal during the presidential campaign what the country needs, it wasn't 10 megawatts or gigawatts or wait a minute, megawatts. I'm getting my numbers mixed up. In any case, we estimated 15,000 gigawatts, which I think is, I gotta go back and do the math. But what it comes to is Biden's goal is, we came up with 15,000 gigawatts needed to have 100% renewable energy by 2030. So Biden's goal is 1/1500th of what we need. It's below 1/10 of 1% of what we need. And, I want to thank Garrett Watson for pointing this out. It's just really inadequate. And while it's, the kind of policy we need, the scale is just not sufficient to deal with the crisis we're dealing with. And meanwhile, we now have the summary for policymakers from the International Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report. And the thing is, the summary contradicts or even reverses what's recommended in the actual 2,900-page report. And it was watered down because the summary has to be approved by the governments of the world. So the OPEC countries, the EU countries, the USA, Russia, China, India, all contributed to weakening or reversing these recommendations. I'll just give you a few examples. They removed the statement that we need to rapidly reduce fossil fuel burning. Duh, I mean, everybody knows that, but they took it out of the summary for policymakers. They took out the need to phase out coal-fired power plants as rapidly as possible. It reversed the negative assessment of nuclear power as a decarbonization strategy. I mean, people ask questions on this podcast about this. I mean, again, that's duh. It costs too much and takes too long to get these nuclear plants up and running. And with the same investment, we can do a lot more in wind and solar. It reversed the negative assessment of carbon capture and sequestration technologies. It deleted references to the disproportionate carbon footprints of the rich compared to the poor, and deleted 6 paragraphs in the original draft on energy demand reduction strategies, and also deleted reference in the transition pathways that emphasized equity. In other words, a just transition. And there's a lot on this. There was a fuller discussion that was in the editor's note to the current issue of Monthly Review. And we should be able to get that link to that editor's notes in the chat if you want to read more about it. But the bottom line is we got to read the full report for the science, including the assessment of the scientists that, quote, the character of social and economic development produced by the nature of capitalist society is ultimately unsustainable. The scientists are trying to tell us something. We need system change if we're going to stop climate change. So let me close this discussion of climate with a more positive note. And that is, about 75-minute drive from here, maybe 60 miles as the crow flies, in Ithaca, New York, a small city of 30,000. They've adopted a Green New Deal with a goal of 100% clean energy by 2030, and plan to commit $100 million to that. And one of the features of this is a computer model that Cornell researchers have developed that models all 8,000 buildings in the city and estimates the cost of retrofitting and future electricity grid loads on a building by building basis across the city. So you've got a planning tool to retrofit all these buildings for zero or negative carbon emissions. It doesn't go into another big component of going to 100% clean energy, and that is electrifying all transportation for the city. But this map is something that all of us, we've had many questions, what can we do at the local level on a Green New Deal? Well, check this out. It's a Bloomberg article, and let's get that in the chat. And Bloomberg articles usually have paywalls, but this one doesn't every time I've looked at it. And so I think you should be able to get to it and check it out. I think this is something that, what we got to do now with, the failure of the federal government, the Democrats not having enough votes because they got conservative Democrats that won't go along with the, what they call Build Back Better, which, as we've criticized here, was not enough, but it was starting to move in the right direction. They don't have enough votes for that. And if the, predictions are right, the Republicans are going to take back control of at least the House. And then nothing's going to get done on climate. And in 2024, Biden's not looking too good. So you could get a Republican president. And, that is a disaster for the climate, the planet. With the Democrats, there was maybe a little possibility that a mass movement could pressure them. With the Republicans, they'll be impervious to that. So we're in a bad situation. But what we can do is show the way at the local level for state and federal and the world's governments. I mean, think of that summary for policymakers that was watered down in the 6th assessment report. So check that out. And, that's something we can do in our communities. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Jean Los Pascalides, do we really need the Senate? We really don't need it. I've been advocating for the abolition of the Senate for decades. I had an article in Roll Call, which is a Capitol Hill, publication oriented to the Congress and the staff, and made the case for the abolition of the Senate. The difficulty there is that the Fifth Amendment, which concerns Fifth Article of the Constitution, which concerns amendments, says you need unanimous consent of the Senate to change how the Senate is composed. So you're not going to do it through the normal amendment process. It would really take a constitutional convention. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about it and expose how just senators from a few states that are low in population can block what all the rest of the country wants to do. It's a counter-majoritarian, anti-democratic institution. It was designed that way, and it certainly functions that way today as much as ever. So we should be talking about abolishing the Senate. It's been in party programs. The Socialist Party had it as part of their program when Eugene Debs was running for president back in the early 20th century. Justice V, any thoughts on the Summit of the Americas and the inclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and subsequently Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador? And she provides a link to an article about Biden unveils plan to manage migration at the summit. And I did hear a news report on that. And, they're trying to get these countries to cooperate in managing migration and trying to make it legal. And I don't think it's really going to change the fact that you're going to have more people trying to come here than the legalized system can accommodate. And if you wait until you get permission to come by going through the United States Embassy in your home country, you're going to wait for years, if not decades, if not forever. And people are in such dire straits they can't afford to do that. So they're coming, which is why we've called for open borders and a plan to accommodate the migrations that are coming. I mean, right now, a lot of it has to do with people fleeing wars, but more and more it's climate change. And there are predictions of up to 1 billion people on the move by 2050. That's 30 years from now, which means it's going to start a lot sooner because of climate change. There are going to be whole areas of the world that will become inhospitable to human habitation, expansion of deserts, and arid areas where you can't grow crops, particularly in the tropic and semi-tropical areas. So people are going to be moving to what are now the temperate areas in a survival mode. And if we don't have a way of helping that migration and helping people settle into what are sustainable modes of production and ways of livelihood, we're going to end up having all kinds of violent conflict over this. And the right is going to use this. They're going to say these other people are coming to take what you got. And if you're losing what you got because of other economic problems, people are going to be susceptible to that, blame the others. When the corporate power structure is the responsible party, but then, they will try to blame ethnic minorities, immigrants, religious minorities. And we see that from the far right in this country, the far right in Europe. And, so we got a serious problem here. And the fact that, Biden wanted to exclude these authoritarian governments, that's, why do that? I mean, we've got to talk with these people in these countries about a whole host of problems. And it's not like the U.S. is innocent in not promoting authoritarian governments in Latin America. In fact, our long history has been supporting anti-democratic governments, coups, violent overthrows of democratically elected officials in Guatemala, in Chile, in Venezuela, and so forth. So I think Biden, handled that poorly, and it probably hasn't improved the United States relationship with Latin America. It may have solidified the solidarity of countries in Latin America that want a fair deal with the U.S. because they either were not invited or they boycotted because others were not invited. So I don't think the Biden administration handled that in a constructive way by any means. Jason Goetzinger. Yet Biden has a trip to the progressive UAE coming up soon. Such hypocrisy. Yeah, and to the Saudi, the Saudi monarchy. There's no consistency. They're getting a little bit of political capital for trying to defend Ukraine from the Russian invasion. And that's the exception to the rule. Often we're the invaders, or we're supporting countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia that are creating what right now, maybe until Ukraine, was the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, in Yemen. With tens of thousands of people dying from hunger and starvation, or dying from aerial bombardment and just the war. So yeah, there's enormous hypocrisy there. Bonnie Cannon, could you give us your analysis of inflation? Well, I think the first thing to say is don't listen to the right-wingers who say it's driven by wage increases, because wages are growing slower than inflation. I think we can say part of it is driven by corporate profits. In fact, a study came out recently saying about half the rise in the prices we're seeing is due to corporate profits rising. And they could do that because they're oligopolies. They're just a few corporations dominating many markets. We saw that with the baby formula. And so they can raise prices without competition. And they can collude in raising prices without actually getting on the phone and colluding. It's just the leading corporation can set the standard, and then the others will follow suit. And so their reaction to the situation is to raise prices and raise their profits. Now, part of the inflation is due to supply shortages coming out of the COVID pandemic. Oil and gas is the big headline rise in price right now. But what's been happening, the producers have been holding back. Not just U.S. producers, but the OPEC countries, to get a higher price. Which I think, you want to deal with that, we could nationalize the oil companies, and in the short term, increase production to meet the demand, set a price cap, maybe ration, a fair share to everybody, and then you start paying a premium if you go above your ration. There are ways of dealing with this so people aren't hit so hard, but not through the private sector where the oil companies are going to gouge all they can. And, there's been talk of, excess profits tax or windfall profits tax. But again, that's not getting through this Congress, even though the Democrats have the majority by a little bit. There are too many conservative Democrats. It's just not going to happen. We can also say, I don't think inflation has been driven, as some on the right say, by these COVID relief packages. Actually, the stimulus of those packages created more demand, more employment. And when unemployment is relatively low, historically it's cut corporate profits and increased the share of income going to labor because they're in a better bargaining position. But that's not what's happening right now. And that's just showing how strong corporate power is, both in capturing government regulation in their favor and also just their market power, which is becoming more and more concentrated. We haven't had serious antitrust action, let alone the idea of public enterprise socializing production. Hadn't been really done since the antitrust, since the Reagan administration. And the argument back then was, well, we now got a world market with globalization, so there is competition. Didn't really pan out that way. And so, on the other hand, we, with more what they were calling the care economy as part of Build Back Better, and going further than that with Medicare for all and universal public child care, we could reduce the cost of living for most of us. You get more care and health care or child care per dollar spent through the public sector than you do with private providers with government subsidies, helping the low income people. It costs less to consumers than the privatized services. And then you have the example of drug prices, which in this country are just ridiculous. We pay 10 times, 50 times, depending on the drug, more than they do right across the border in Canada, because we have a law against Medicare, a big purchaser could be a big purchaser of drugs, negotiating those prices with the pharmaceutical companies. And then, of course, another option is to socialize the pharmaceutical companies, the drug companies, because mostly they rely on publicly subsidized research to then pull out new products they can patent and sell at exorbitant prices. So there are a lot of things we could do about inflation. And I think it really comes down to corporate power, between their market power, their power over government to get favorable regulations, and their opposition to social provision of basic needs like healthcare and childcare, that they're able to raise prices and raise their profits at our expense. And so a lot of this inflation is due to that. And the other part of it, the supply shortages and supply chain bottlenecks we've had because of COVID, we can overcome that better with government action than just relying on the market to, willy-nilly get supply back in to meet the demand. Because when the supply is short and demand is high, the prices are going to rise. So those are some of my thoughts on inflation. And the biggest thing is we need a more public provision of basic needs and less corporate power over the market. Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on Biden begging Saudi Arabia for more oil? Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Instead of putting our energy into renewables, and Biden's there begging Saudi Arabia to produce more oil so it can get to Europe so they don't have to buy it from Russia. Well, why not, instead of emphasizing increasing oil production and imports into Europe, put more emphasis on building renewables, on a crash program? During World War II, we had the crash program to build arms to defeat the fascist powers. And the federal government took over a quarter of manufacturing capacity to do that. It was an emergency program. We're in a climate emergency, and the war in Ukraine is an emergency. So why not, use government power? The Defense Production Act is part of that I talked about earlier, to just ramp up renewables and put all the energy and money into that instead of trying to expand oil production, when that's just going to make the climate crisis worse. And electrifying transportation, because that's what most of the oil goes for, internal combustion engines. I mean, that's a classic example of where you can convert. Right now, there are a lot of electric car manufacturers, and you just, between mandates, like you can't sell internal combustion engines after a certain date, like 2025. The industry is talking at 2035. In Europe, I heard, was thinking about setting 2035 as a date. But we can go a lot faster, and we need to. So that's what I think, begging Saudi Arabia for more oil, to hell with Saudi Arabia. It's they killed that journalist, Khashoggi, in Turkey. They're killing people in Yemen. They just executed 80 people, the largest mass execution in I don't know how long. That's really a right-wing government. And we done lost. Oh, here I am. I thought I'd lost the screen. So anyway, I thought I was cut off, but I'm not. So anyway, yeah, Saudi Arabia is not a friend of anybody but the super rich and the big oil. And so I don't like Biden going there and begging for oil. Jason Goetzinger, Did you hear the chairman of the Fed talking about skimming the froth off the labor market? Powell was appointed by Trump and retained by Biden. They are not that different. Yeah, I mean, raising interest rates is going to raise the costs of to consumers, for housing and auto loans and student loans and the whole, everything consumers buy. It also raises the cost of business to borrow, which means, what they're trying to do to clamp down on inflation is to raise unemployment and put us in a recession. And, that is not in the people's interest. And, but that's, conventional thinking from the Fed. And the fact that Powell was retained by Biden, I don't get, I get tired of hearing these Democrats say, we got to vote Democrat to stop Trump. And then Biden does things Trump would do, like reappoint Powell. And actually, Trump might not have done that because he wants total loyalty. And even though he doesn't know what he's talking about, if he's not getting the results he wants, like inflation, he'll just fire the head of the Fed just to look like he was doing something. But the thing that gets me is Biden is still touting bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow his election. The people that tried to overthrow the election should be headed for jail. They should be facing charges. And instead, Biden's trying to cut deals with them. That's not how you fight fascists. And that's what really bugs me about Biden. And, appointing Powell, it's like Barack Obama. He kept Gates for defense, and who else? He brought in several people from the Bush administration, kept them on, and tried to do the same thing. Tried to work with the Republicans, tried to do bipartisanship with the party. They didn't care about really legislating solutions. They just cared about preventing Obama from getting anything done so he looked bad. That's the Republican Party. And, to try to cut deals and work with them is basically asking to undermine, what you're trying to do. So it doesn't make any sense to me. Scout Trooper 164, what are your thoughts on Biden admitting he knew of the baby formula shortage? Well, I hadn't heard he admitted knowing, I guess, earlier than the rest of us. But if that's true, then why the hell didn't he do something about it sooner? I mean, this is an industry where I think Abbott, the company that shut down their big factory because of, real problems in contaminating the formula, they had 50% of the market. The next biggest company, I think, had 40%. So the big two companies had 90% of the market. That's a case of, where you need antitrust if you're going to rely on competition. And, and then I guess right now they're trying to get Abbott production back up and they're importing from overseas. And it looks like they were too late to avoid a crisis for a lot of, babies and young children that need the baby formula. Not just because they need, it's the only kind of nutrition they can take, but some need special formulas because they've got, congenital digestive issues. And so this has hurt a lot of people. So if he's admitted he knew of it before it came, he's also admitting he didn't do something about it when he could have earlier. Santino Musto, I'm a huge fan of Ralph Nader's book, Crashing the Party, how you were actually name-checked in the appendix as a member of the Naderverse. Have you ever considered writing a book on your experiences as a presidential candidate? I have considered writing a book on my experiences in the Green Party, going back to the very beginning. And it's still on my list. And the reason I haven't started is I got asked to run for president. So I don't know if I have a book just about the presidential campaign in 2020. I think that fits into a longer story about, the Green Party and its growing pains and its successes and shortcomings. So that is something I would like to do at some point. Nader's book, Crashing the Party, really deals with unprecedented attack on ballot access on Ralph Nader. And Richard Winger at Ballot Access News has documented this. Never before or since has a party, in this case, the Democratic Party, gone to such great lengths to keep their competition off the ballot. It was frivolous lawsuits. In the case of Oregon, they were trying to set up a ballot line for a progressive party line. And this is 2004. And they had to have a convention of 500 people or something. And so the Democrats went in there and got there early and took all the seats up so the convention couldn't happen. And they had to reschedule it. There were violent attacks on petitioners in Massachusetts that were, Democratic Party hacks. I mean, there's a whole story there, and Crashing the Party tells a lot of it, but I'm not sure it tells all of it. It was very repressive, and the Democrats still, scapegoat Ralph for their own mistakes. And he was on Robert Shear's podcast this week, and one of the things that got me to listen to it was Ralph was referencing what the populists did in the late 19th century, where they, had lots of face-to-face meetings, these encampments, almost like, church revivals. In fact, a lot of the populists in the prairie were, they'd gone to these Christian revival gatherings, and they kind of replicated that in a political revival. And a lot of, door-to-door personal face-to-face meetings. And in the context today where everybody's watching screens all the time and not engaging with each other directly, Ralph was saying that's what we got to get back to. There's a huge vacuum there politically because the Democrats and Republicans are doing, advertising and emails and direct mail, but not that much at the grassroots. The party structures, used to have, they call them political machines. There was some negativity about that because they weren't very democratic. But on the other hand, you knew who the representative of the party was in your precinct. If you had an issue, you knew who to go to, who would get it to the, the city councilor, the member of Congress, whatever was appropriate. And we don't have that now. So people are isolated and atomized from politics. And they're just getting messages, through these screens and never talk to each other. And, that's how people, they talk, they listen, but they also talk, and we develop our ideas collectively and our confidence in being, citizens with some power. And that's missing. And so, I'm a big Ralph fan. And that was, if you look up Robert Shear's podcast, Ralph was on there for an hour this week. And that's one of the things he talked about, along with his usual stuff on corporate power and corporate welfare and, his longtime themes. And so that might be something you want to listen to. DeMitton, why do you think socialism is so prolific in the first of the 1900s, yet it was totally destroyed after they wasted millions of lives to finally fight and defeat the fascists in Europe? Well, I think socialism was prolific in the, I think you mean the first part of the early 2000s or 20th century, 1900s, right? 1900, I'm getting the years, centuries mixed up. Yeah. In this country, it was the Debsian socialists, the Socialist Party, until the mid-30s was, a real alternative. They elected thousands of people to public office, including a few dozen to, if you count the progressive and farmer labor parties in Wisconsin and Minnesota, by 1936, they had, thousands in local offices, a lot of state legislators, 13 members of Congress, 4 senators, 2 governors. And what happened in the mid-30s was the communists decided they were going to do what they called a popular front. So they had and recommended that the socialist left ally with the liberal capitalists like Franklin Roosevelt in this country and counterparts in other countries. And that was a united front in fact, the popular front against fascism. The united front used on the left meant you get the socialists, the communists, and other left-wing parties that were anti-capitalist and independent of the capitalist parties together in a united front to defeat the fascists. And that probably would have worked. The popular front, what it ended up doing was co-opting the socialists into the liberal capitalist parties, like here, the Democratic Party. And they stopped talking about socialism and became, the hacks, the grunt workers for liberal Democrats, New Deal Democrats, until the 1970s when the New Deal Democrats were replaced by the corporate New Democrats. And that really happened when Congressman Coelho out of California led the Democrats into seeking corporate money like never before and abandoning a lot of those New Deal proposals like Medicare for all. So by the time you get to Clinton, when the New Democrat label was adopted by him and others, the Democrats abandoned, they used to call it national health insurance, what we today call Medicare for all. So I'm trying to remember what the original question was. It's off the screen, but I'm explaining. Why was socialism stronger in the early 1900s? It also, and again in this country, came out of the populist tradition, which was clearly, at least the left wing of it was clearly independent of the old two parties. And they got co-opted because part of it, the more opportunistic politicians in it, in the states that were less organized as the populist movement, they merged and cross-endorsed the Democrat, William Jennings Bryan, in 1896. And that was really the death of the populist movement. But that socialistic farmer labor movement was reborn in the Socialist Party, by the early 1900s. But since then, the left, the socialist left, has mostly worked within the Democratic Party, not advancing socialism, but advancing first New Deal liberalism and then neoliberalism as the lesser evil to what the Republicans offer. And that's a real problem. So I think that's part of it. The old socialist principle of working class political independence from the capitalist classes, the capitalist parties, was abandoned in the 30s. And it's sort of become the common sense on the progressive side that you got to work with the Democrats because our political system only allows for two parties. How about the idea of changing the system with proportional representation and ranked choice voting? That's something, the Greens are pushing. I've been pushing it, particularly since my experience in 2020, because what we got now is, the winner-take-all single-member district system tends to produce two parties, tends to make a third party on the left, quote-unquote, spoiler, because you could split the vote between the center and the left, and the right gets elected even though they're less popular. But instead of accepting that system, which inevitably makes the left marginal, irrelevant politically, why don't we change the system? And we've been doing that at the local level with a lot of ranked choice voting, including proportional ranked choice voting in some communities, some municipalities. That's what we got to build on and expand that to the state level and then the federal level. So I think, socialists had a tradition of independent political action. They lost it in the 30s. And the broad progressive movement has accepted this single member district winner take all system, which tends to create two parties and makes a left party the quote unquote the spoiler. That's not the case in most democracies around the world, which have proportional systems. So the left needs to take note of that and make changing how we elect people. We need to have proportional representation in legislative bodies, ranked choice voting for the executive offices, so that people can vote for what they want, including people on the left can vote for a left party without worrying about helping their worst enemy. That seems to me to be really something needs to be at the top of our political agenda. And I hope we can make progress on that in the next few years. Santino Musto, do you think the horrible current political climate can attract more progressives to the Green Party in 2024, as was the case for Jill Stein in 2016? The lesser of two evils game has to stop and Biden has shown us he won't work with progressives. Well, I think that remains to be seen. Remember, in 2016, it was an open seat, and the candidates for the major parties were the two most unpopular candidates in history. Trump was the most unpopular by favorability ratings in public opinion polling, and Clinton was the second most unpopular. So it was a situation where a third party, and Jill Stein had a good opportunity to get a lot of votes because so many people hated both the major party candidates. I'm afraid in 2024 we're going to be in a similar dynamic that we were in 2020, and that the Republicans, whether it's Trump or Santis or really anybody that the Republicans are likely to nominate, is going to be an extremist on the right. And the Democrats will nominate some damn centrist who's going to at least not be a fascist. And, the whole progressive side of the political spectrum is say, we got to vote for the Democrat to stop the fascists. It's a different dynamic than 2016. So it's going to be difficult. That's why I emphasize we got to be pushing for ranked choice voting and proportional representation. And it's, highly unlikely we'll get that by the presidential election in 2024. It has to be an issue we raise in that election. And hopefully we can build at the local level. You're right, though, that given that, the Democrats have abjectly failed on even their most modest reforms concerning, healthcare, climate, what they're calling the care economy, child care, anti-poverty programs. They just failed. And they doubled down on militarism. I've got some heat for saying I think the Ukrainians should, have the arms they need to defend themselves wherever they can get them from. On the other hand, our military budget's increasing. We just sent them, went over this a couple of podcasts ago, $40 million, about half of it's military, half humanitarian and non-military programs, dealing like $5 billion for dealing with the world hunger crisis that we have now because, grain out of Russia and Ukraine's not getting to the world market. So, but the question is, why did they have to appropriate another $40 billion? The military budget is already swollen. And now, Biden is proposing to ratchet it up now to $813 billion just for the Pentagon. And when you add in what goes to the Department of Energy for nuclear weapons and the State Department for paramilitary and covert action, the black budgets of the intelligence community, it's over $1 trillion. And when you add in veterans benefits, which could be considered part of the military budget for past wars, it's like 1.2 trillion, 1.3 trillion. It's just an enormous waste. And, the Democrats have accelerated that, and this has been true. We thought we might get a little peace dividend after Vietnam, but Carter increased military budgets more than Ford had projected. And then when Clinton got in after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of talk about a peace dividend. And Clinton asked for more money than George H.W. Bush had projected in his military budgets before he was defeated in that 1992 election. Obama's military budget, more money for the surge in Afghanistan. The Democrats have not, been anti-militarist any more than the Republicans. So there are a lot of reasons why progressives should be looking for an alternative. But it comes back to, the problem is our electoral system makes the practical, likely alternative of an extremist Republican. So that's what we face in 2024. And it makes it harder for the Greens than it's ever been because the Republicans, they're not just a conservative party anymore. They're an extremist anti-democratic party. Julie Balmer, how do you feel about gas prices rising every day? Sorry if it's been asked already. Well, I don't like it. It costs me a lot when I fill up my tank. And as I said, the way we should deal with this is, I think, just take over the oil companies who have kept production down, even though, which means low supply, high prices, along with Saudi Arabia and OPEC countries. We could take them over, get more gas to the market, have price controls on it, maybe even ration it, like we did during World War II. And then if you need more than your ration, you got to pay for it. There are ways of dealing with this, but you ask how I feel about it. I don't feel good about it because it's, my budget didn't account for, an increase of $2 a gallon over, I guess, the last year. It's quite an increase. It's quite a shock to the budget. Amy L. Sachs, Howie, are write-in votes even tallied and publicized in New York? They are tallied, and they do show up, at least on the Board of Election website, in the end. They are not in Oregon, last time I noticed. I'm not sure about Oregon. There are some states they won't even count them. And we found that out during the presidential race where we didn't get on the ballot. And sometimes they count them, but they don't make them public. I think in Pennsylvania, the counties reported, but the state didn't. So you had to add up the counties to get a number. So if you look at the official vote total for our campaign in 2020 that the Federal Election Commission gave to Congress, we got just over 405,000 votes. But actually, we got a few thousand more than that because some states didn't get their write-ins counted until after the early February 2021 deadline for the FEC. And the rest of it says, and they're very rigid, Ray, how the line must be filled out if it is to be counted. Yeah, you got to spell it right. And, the enforcement of that, and it's usually local county boards of elections that do the counting. A lot of it depends on who that actual operative is, looking at the ballots and writing down the write-ins and how strict they are about the spelling. In some states, you're supposed to construe it liberally. So if it's phonetically similar, like my running mate, Gloria Matera, it's Materra. If they write R, just one R, should they count that or not? I think they should because the intent of the voter is clear. But in some states, they won't. So yeah, it's an issue. But we shouldn't even be talking about write-in votes. We should be talking about everybody who's, at all serious should be on the ballot and let the voters decide. Not the, some arcane procedures for getting on the ballot that are difficult to meet. Andrew Hager, Howie, I'll understand if this question is irrelevant to the subject at hand, but regarding rail preservation, are steam and diesel locomotives worth preserving or better off scrapped? Well, we have this question. I wonder if Andrew keeps asking the same question. But look, diesel and steam, well, diesel are really diesel electric locomotives. So, nowadays they use diesel oil. In the old days of the steam, they used coal. But they're electric motors. So we need to electrify the rail system. And so, maybe preserving a few for, exhibition, museums, nostalgia. But, for the lion's share of rail transportation, it should be electrified. And electricity will power electric motors, which are very powerful. When they first built the Northern Railroad over the Rockies, they deliberately went with electric power and had hydro dams and wires on the track to power those electric locomotives over the higher parts of the Rocky Mountains. And that's because the electric motors are more powerful. So that's what we got to be moving toward. Even if steam and diesel are more energy efficient, we can do better with electric trains. Andrew Hager, any thoughts on replacing USA golf courses with homes and houses for the homeless and poverty stricken? Well, golf courses are an environmental issue with, it's monoculture grass, a lot of pesticides usually, and and then does the public have access? All those kinds of questions. Now, the homes and the homeless, what we need is more homes, and that's why we've been advocating more public housing that's high quality, mixed income, so you're not, concentrating poverty in these projects. Built green, um, and you build enough public housing until everybody has an affordable option. And you have projects which mix, professional people, blue collar working people, and low income people. So the poverty is not concentrated. And if we did that, like they do in a lot of European countries, then the private housing market rents would come down because they would have to compete with the public options. So we can do that. I don't think we need to go after the golf courses. I think there are environmental questions about golf courses that probably should be dealt with separately. Justice V, any specific thoughts about the California Reparations Task Force panel and its interim report that outlines a list of preliminary recommendations and key proposals it says California lawmakers could initiate? No specific thoughts. I've only seen the headline. I haven't read the stories or the report itself. But I'm glad to see it's being done, and I intend to look at it as soon as I can. Well, our hour's up, so I haven't been able to follow the chat. I was just trying to answer the questions. So, I guess I'll just leave you with, I think one of the things our petition experience in New York tells us is our grassroots base has shrunk. Back between 2002 and 2010, we did two petitions. One time we got 24,000 signatures, one time 27,000. So this time we got, a third to a quarter of that. So I think, that's one measure of how we've shrunk. Why have we shrunk? I think there's been the push of Trump and the pull of Sanders into the Democratic Party. And then in the last 2 years, COVID has really made it hard for our locals to meet and organize and do activities. So I think, one of the lessons is we've got to, rebuild the base. And I see that across the country. There's a lot of people on screens. There's a lot of, stuff on the internet, but not too much out in the streets. And most people out here, I think they were surprised when we were petitioning. I ran into a lot of people that just couldn't figure out what the hell I was talking about. Petitioning to get on the ballot, political parties. They've had no contact with political parties. They just get advertising on TV, and most people don't vote because they can't figure out what all that crap in the advertising means or who's on what side. And the people more informed are pretty stuck in their with their tribes, Democratic and Republican. But there is a vacuum at the grassroots. So, I say this a lot on this podcast. We got to organize. We got to meet face to face, work things out collectively, because it'll all make us all smarter. It will, improve our skills in speaking and arguing and writing as we, put out leaflets and statements. And then we got to knock on doors and talk to people and listen as much as we preach, or actually listen more than we preach. A lot of people just respect the fact that we're there. We're concerned about what they think. And that's how we build support. That's how we recruit more members. That's how we build a movement. So I guess I'm urging people now that the weather's good and people are more relaxed about COVID. I don't know how smart that is because variants are still developing and the world's not vaccinated. But, using precautions, it's time to get out there and organize. So I hope that's what you'll be doing, and we'll see you next week.